Hey, it's been a couple Fridays since we chatted about a new book. I'm sorry about that. If you are new or newer to the channel, my name is Melody, and on most every Friday, we talk about a book, dig a little deeper into a book, and today that book is The American Daughters by Maurice Ruffin. Now, generally I try to do this as spoiler-free as possible. Today, based on what I want to discuss in this book, I cannot unfortunately guarantee we are going to be completely spoiler-free. So just want to give that caveat at the beginning in case you are looking or hoping to dive into this book, whether soon or in the future, so you can kind of gauge based on your own preferences in terms of reviews. And this is kind of the perfect introduction to a Feature Friday. Well, hopefully, it is ideally the perfect kind of introduction to a Feature Friday if you haven't been here before, because while I have somewhat mixed feelings about this book, there is a lot to dive into in terms of how the book is working, the ideas, and the mechanics of the book itself, which is something I really try and do in these spaces. So just as a periodic reminder, I don't do star ratings in these videos at any point. You will generally get an idea of how I'm feeling about a book, but I will do my best to dive into the why in terms of how the book is working and why I am having a reaction in a certain way, with the caveat always that it is a generally subjective reaction and you may respond differently to the same pieces, especially as something that I don't like, you may really enjoy. Now, what I'm most intrigued to dive into in relation to this book is an idea that I think I raised in passing probably years ago and haven't found a really great example to dive into until this moment. And that is the idea of a blurb setting expectations that may or may not match the insides of a book and how that can impact reader enjoyment based on expectations going in. So let me read you just a snippet of this jacket copy, but the biggest snippet that is what drew me to this book, along with this fantastic cover. So this snippet says, a gripping novel about a spirited girl who joins a sisterhood bound by love and justice, working to undermine the Confederates. So this book centers around a young Black woman coming of age. She starts as a young girl at the beginning of the book. We follow her coming of age. We see her with her mother. And the promise is that she is going to be joining a ring of spies to, as the jacket says, undermine the Confederacy. And so there is that promise of this reclaiming of power and this kind of getting one over on these frankly evil men amidst the background of slavery and the start of the Civil War. And so that was what drew me in. And I've seen this played with to varying degrees, especially in like Alyssa Cole's Loyal League series, though that is a romance series and that's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. But the spy ring angle is absolutely what drew me to this book. And to be completely honest, that is a very small part of the book and a small part that doesn't really happen until the last third. Structurally, it is a very short book. It is under 300 pages. It did take me longer than I would have liked to get through, both because of the kind of switch up of subject matter and also just personal stuff going on. And so I also understand that my interactions with this book were to some degree also impacted by just outside life stressors, and I'm trying to be very aware of that. But the first third-ish of the book really is dealing with our protagonist Addie and her mother as they are sold. Editing me just popping in to correct my verbiage here because they were sold to a slave owner, and I think it's important to just call it what it is. In New Orleans, and them working within his household in New Orleans. And this section also chronicles an escape attempt that ultimately lands Addie and her mother on the plantation. Though one of the specificities of language within the book that I thought was really powerful is that throughout, instead of calling it a plantation, it always refers to plantations as a slave labor camp, also called a plantation, really framing the violence of that center and not allowing it to hide behind the word. And there really is violence at the center at the beginning of this book, which I knew to expect just in terms of the themes we were playing with, the setting we were playing with, but it was much more present than I was expecting, especially because I was going in expecting to see that undermined, and it didn't have quite the payoff of that I was personally expecting, and asked us to sit in a lot of that pain, and so it's just something to be aware of. At the same time, there is a lot of the more traumatic bits that absolutely happen in the book that the narrative does kind of talk around, and we will go into a little bit more of that structure and the language a little bit later, but in relation to the overarching structure, we have that section. The middle section finds Addie back in New Orleans and really is more of the center of the kind of coming of age part, and it focuses on the community she finds by sneaking away to work with a free Black woman, Lenore, who runs a business, a bar, tavern, etc., that is kind of a hub of that community, and the freedom that Addie finds there, the connection that Addie finds there, both in terms of her friendship, but also in her relationship with Lenore specifically a little bit more. And this is how she connects to the spy network that is alluded to in the book. And it's referenced here. We see it kind of come to pass, but we don't really see the active spying as much. We see Addie use it and the information she is able to get within the household she is in as a way in more with this group of women, and also as a way to make some kind of change in her world. Again, absolutely what I was expecting, but we're a little bit, or a lot of it, pulled back from the active spying bit. We are not necessarily seeing them go on missions, but we are absolutely reminded of the danger they're putting themselves in and what all this means, which gets us to the last like 80 pages where we see a little bit more active of a plan where Addie is attempting to take down the man who owns her and has really made her life awful for all of the obvious reasons. And so in many ways, while it is a political move because this man is becoming a name for the Confederacy within New Orleans, it is also a matter of revenge and reclaiming power. And it also circles us back to the very beginning of the book, because we open with this plot in play, which would lead you as a reader to believe that that spying is going to be much more active in what is going on than it ends up being, at least for me as a reader, and you may find that a much more present, active subplot than I did. But this is very interesting and is the first kind of clue to the experimental structure of the book. While this reads as a very straightforward historical fiction in a lot of ways, there are these moments that give glimpses or clues to the more experimental nature of the piece that is really revealed at the very end. And one of these clues is the beginning of the book and just how we're thrust directly into the action in a way where we're really having to play catch up. And I had to reread sections and be like, is that correct? I anticipated actually rereading it, and I reread parts, but I anticipated by the end that I would need to go back to the beginning to kind of see the full picture clearly. And so I appreciated being thrown into the action in that way because it kept me on my toes and it trusted me as a reader. And then we fell back more into expected patterns of historical fiction, but between chapters we would often get these like historical records that would kind of push into the future and allude to something going on with the history of this story. And so it is kind of in conversation with the action of the piece where we would hear from Addie's descendants and get a clue to what is going on, but sometimes it would directly make you or make me as a reader question what was going on in a really interesting way, and in a way that kind of kept things unfinished until the end. There were times where I thought maybe I just wasn't getting it, and then we got to the end that kind of recontextualized the whole story, and I went, oh. But the end then did make me question whether the rest of the book was worth that at the end, because it was very clearly meant to reframe everything we had just read. And it did answer a lot of the questions stylistically, or a lot of the worries I had stylistically, in terms of things like the character work. I've talked before about it feeling like narratives are keeping me at arm's length in some way, and not being able to fully articulate how I feel about that or what I think causes that. And I was having a similar experience in this book, and it was kind of shaking me up a little bit. But then I got to the end where I don't want to spoil too much, but again, it's recontextualizing things, and it makes that kind of distance make sense, because it kind of questions the composite of the story and the idea that Addie may be more of an idea than just a character in some ways, or that her story may have been manipulated in some ways, which makes some of the action feel a little disjointed. And so I understand why it was done that way, because the ending tells us that was all purposeful. So like, for instance, Addie's relationship with Lenore, when it moves into a more romantic tenor, it felt somewhat rushed to me as a reader, and it didn't feel like the emotional beats really made sense in terms of where we had come from, in terms of how quickly it escalated and the action of it. But then getting to the end, I get an explanation of that. So in a lot of ways, it's ingenious. However, I still had like 270 pages where things didn't always feel connected, and there were moments of confusion. And so just because I have the answer at the end doesn't negate the storytelling that got me there, especially again because I was expecting something much different from the framing of the blurb than what I got, even within that experimental kind of structure, which, even as it was very interesting, especially at the end, in some ways that did feel a little bit like a Deus Ex Machina. It kind of was an easy wave answer to kind of smooth over a lot of the disjointed bits, even if reading it, knowing the disjointedness is incredibly purposeful. But there were times I wish it had almost then pushed further to make it clearer that we were operating in a kind of experimental realm, because I love historical fiction and I love weird fiction. I love experimental fiction. I don't know that I would go so far as to call this speculative, but I think it was playing with some really interesting ideas in terms of storytelling, and especially the importance of stories and the importance of mythologizing in some ways, coming out of slavery, coming out of the Civil War, and how that is a form of reclaiming of power as well. And I know that I cannot speak on that to its full depth, but I loved the idea there. And so I understand the instinct and the want to have that idea really hit at the end. And I'm sorry to kind of be spoiling that idea at the end, which I really think is the central idea of the book in a lot of ways. But there's always the possibility we've lost readers along the way. To be fair, that's always kind of the case, but especially with the inclusion of these kind of fake primary sources amidst this third person story, I think there was the opportunity to keep pushing that stylistically, or even to make where it felt disjointed, or this idea of the narrative kind of keeping us at a distance, which felt like a somewhat passive experience for me as a reader. Again, I kind of internalized that and felt like it was something about me as a reader and my responses, rather than what the narrative wanted me to feel in some ways, because I do think some of that was purposeful. I don't think I wasn't supposed to care about Addie by any means, and I am by no means saying that I didn't care about Addie, but I do think that there was some kind of that muffling of the immediacy at play at some points. I do think some of that muffling was absolutely necessary, and I'm glad that choice was made. But I also think that there was potentially an opportunity to push that experimental form even a little further, make it a little bit more evident to the reader without fully showing the hand. Maybe it was about pulling in even more fake first-person accounts, kind of showing the conflicting narratives and the conflict of record that can be kind of inherent in the historical record. There are references made to Addie's journal throughout, including in some of the revelation at the end. So again, we're not seeing things from Addie directly, and Addie's voice isn't speaking to us directly. And again, that becomes part of the larger point, but maybe pulling in some more of her voice or her purported voice so that then we are forced to kind of confront that discrepancy even more at the end could have been something of note. Now, I do want to be clear that when I say things can be pushed potentially even more to the extreme to kind of make some of those discordant notes in the narrative kind of strike a little harder with a little bit more intentionality so that we as readers can kind of earmark it and have a little bit better sense that something more may be at play here, that we may need to be reading with potentially a different eye. And again, I was reading this in a very odd headspace, so maybe I just missed some of those markers. Absolutely possible. Still, at the end, we do kind of spiral into that a little bit. We move a little bit more absurd, and we don't transpose directly back on to the beginning of the book in the way I expected, and in a way that made me kind of question where we were in that moment. But at the same time, by the time we got to that ending scene, when we came full circle to the beginning, I was a little admittedly frustrated with the narrative and where we were. So I think it's just a matter of allowing the narrative to breathe and be what it is amidst some admittedly deceptive marketing. But also, again, I think there were opportunities to push what it was exploring even more. At the end of the day, in some ways, this is a coming of age story as much as anything. So again, if you are personally going in for the spy ring angle of it, I would caution you to kind of adjust your expectations there. But I also think that there are also a lot of really interesting ideas to engage with in this book, and it will facilitate a lot of conversation for sure if you're looking for something for book club potentially, especially if you have a book club that gravitates toward historical fiction and doesn't mind something a little weird and experimental at times, though not fully weird and experimental, because I know personally that that's something that I really enjoy, and so I don't want to mislead you on that side either. There are elements, there are hints, but not fully. So that is where I'm kind of sitting with it. I know it doesn't really give you the full sense of the thing, but again, I think there was something really interesting to dive into here in terms of expectations versus reality. And let me know where you may have had that experience with a book, where you go in potentially expecting one thing because of the marketing, because of the jacket copy, whatever, and you get something completely different, and whether that worked out for you as a reader, whether you ended up liking it, or how those expectations ultimately impacted your enjoyment of the book. But thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. If you've read this, I'd love to hear yours as well. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah,